Well, good evening. Let me tell you a story. William was born about 500 years ago in what we now think of as England. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family, and so they had the means to send him to college. He went to Cambridge University, he got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Before it was all said and done, he'd be fluent in 8 languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French. And after his studies, because he was deemed a virtuous man, the church allowed him to study theology. William would study to become a clergyman. But his great claim to fame, the reason we're even talking about William 500 years later, is that he had one driving conviction, one core conviction that really drove him all of his life. And his conviction was that the way to God was through the Scriptures. And therefore the Scriptures ought to be in the hands of every common person and in their native language. Now you're sitting here tonight in a home group, you're sitting around someone's living room in a circle. Probably half of you have your own copy of the Bible open in your lap and it's in English. And so William's conviction seems self-evident, seems obvious. But in William's day, that idea was heresy. See, the church thought that the Scripture was so sacred, so special, that you need to have a certain amount of education and training, and you need to be taught in the official teachings of the Scriptures. You just couldn't turn it loose to the common person. I mean, a common person like me and you, we wouldn't know enough to be able to make sense of the Bible, and so it was reserved for a special group of people. Besides that, it was before the printing press, and the only copies of the Scriptures were very expensive because they were handmade, and they were all in Latin. So even if you could get enough money to get yourself a copy, you couldn't read it anyway. So the Scriptures were locked behind this vault of the language, behind the control of the church, and William wanted to set it free. And so William, at the age of 31, he sought an audience with the bishop, and he was seeking permission to translate the New Testament from the original Greek into the English language. But Bishop Tunstall wasn't all that impressed with William, with his academic qualifications and his character. Matter of fact, he didn't even give him an audience. So William was a man with a frustrated vision, a lone voice in a barren land. Probably one of the most famous conversations that William ever had was with a fellow clergyman. And he was sharing his convictions with his fellow pastor. And this pastor said to William, you know, we'd be better off with the Pope's laws than we would be with God's laws. And William responded in what's become a very famous response. He said, I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spares my life, ere many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plow to know more of the Scriptures than the Pope does. And it was this plowboy conviction that drove William across the English Channel and into Europe. He settled in Wittenberg, and he worked on his translation, translating the Greek New Testament into English. When he finished that in 1525 and went to the printing presses, 2 printing houses began to churn out copies of his English New Testament. And those copies made it back to England. And Bishop Tunstall outlawed the copies. It was illegal to sell them, it was illegal to import them, it was illegal to own them. And if you were found with the copy would be burned in public and you would be arrested. And for all of William's hard work, for all of his conviction, he was branded a heretic by the church in 1529. Spent the next 6 years of his life in hiding in Europe, working on translating the Old Testament from the original Hebrew and into English. And after 6 years of translating and working, he was betrayed by a close friend. The church found out where he was, they arrested him, they put him in prison for 500 years in horrible conditions, and finally in 1536 he was tried, condemned as a heretic, executed or condemned to be executed by burning, and he burned at the stake at the mere age of 48 in the year 1536. His last words as the flames were growing were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. His prayer was that the King of England's eyes would be open and understand that the way to God's through the Scriptures, and the Scripture ought to be in the hands of every common person and in their language. William's last prayer was answered within 4 years. The very same king that condemned him to be executed 4 years later authorized an English translation of the Scriptures to be used in the Church of England. Ironically, the Great Bible, as it was called, was almost all of William's work. In fact, almost all English translations since William's death have been based upon his translation, the King James. 95% of the King James was William's work. If you memorized Scripture as a kid in the King James language, 95% of the words you memorized were William Tyndale's work that came from his pen. So in light of what we've been reading in Philippians 3, let me ask you a question. Did William Tyndale know the power of the resurrection? Did William Tyndale know and experience God's transforming power to take something that is weak and transform it into something that is powerful? Did he know the power of the resurrection to subject all things to the headship of Christ? Of course, the fact that you have an English translation in your hands gives us part of the answer, doesn't it? In this morning's sermon, I tried to answer the question, why is it that those who want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, why is it that they must share in the sufferings of Christ? What do the sufferings of Christ look like in our generation and in our culture? Why doesn't God use the power of the resurrection to prevent us from suffering? And why is it that when the New Testament talks about sharing the sufferings of Christ, it calls it a blessing, not a curse? Your group leader has a summary of this morning's sermon, and if y'all want to go over that and review it, you can. But my hope tonight is that you will have an honest conversation as a group. What does it mean to share the sufferings of Christ? Why is this almost a necessity for those of us who want to know Christ? And why is this a blessing? May the Lord bless our church tonight and give us a heart that can count it all joy as we share the sufferings of Christ.